Hey, today we're going to talk about Bokashi composting. I'm going to talk about what Bokashi is, when it makes sense to use, how to do it at home, and then how to use the Bokashi compost itself. So let's talk really quickly about what Bokashi is. Bokashi is just a name given to a special category of composting, and instead of the traditional hot pile or aerobic composting where we're trying to introduce air into the compost constantly, Bokashi composting is anaerobic, which means we want to limit the oxygen in the environment. And instead of constantly introducing oxygen to encourage certain beneficial bacteria to develop and kind of take over that environment, we're inoculating with a particular known bacteria which is not pathogenic and also doesn't tend to smell as bad as some of the traditional anaerobic or kind of the natural anaerobic bacteria. That's where you usually would get the rotting smell from a compost process. So Bokashi is just the name for anaerobic composting in a nutshell. Now, when does it make sense to use Bokashi composting or as the Bokashi composting process? Well, for me personally, it makes the most sense in the winter time. In the summer, really the spring, summer, and fall, all compost for the household goes through either a hot pile compost, a tumbler, BSFL, or vermiculture or vermicomposting. So it's handled through one of those mechanisms. As long as the soil is warm and we can kind of keep the insects and everything and the microbiology healthy outdoors, everything gets put outdoors and never have any issues, spring, summer, and fall. Now in the wintertime, it's basically impossible to run any of those composting processes, at least outdoors. And that's when, to me, Bokashi makes the most sense, because I can take all types of food scraps, even your meat, citrus, high and low pH items, put them right into a Bokashi composter and let that set and kind of ferment through the winter. And then in the summertime or springtime, I can bring it outside and introduce it to another composting process or introduce it directly into the garden. So other times that it might make sense is if you live in an apartment building or kind of a smaller space, or if you have an HOA or just a small yard, or you don't want to compost in your yard, it might make sense then to use Bokashi year-round just to make sure all of your food scraps are composted. Let's move on to how it actually works. And I brought with me here on these straw bales a few examples of Bokashi systems. And I'm going to start with what I currently use. And it's just a commercial product. I just use, I'm not necessarily this brand, I have different brands. All of these buckets are the same though. So this is a commercial Bokashi bucket. It's just a 4 or 5 gallon bucket with a spigot at the bottom, a lid on the top. Very simple thing. If you open the lid up, you can see inside, and you will see there is, right here, there's a separator. This is like a strainer that just allows drainage into the bottom. So very, very simple thing. What you would do, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Let me talk about why I use this instead of a homegrown solution. It's just the ease of use and the all-in-one and the kind of clean process that this allows. I've tried a number of and have made a number of Bokashi composters on my own, most of which are based on a 5-gallon bucket. Works perfectly fine. You can save a lot of money if you want to by using 5-gallon buckets. What I typically have found, if you're interested in doing this yourself, is I buy these little separators which are used for washing a car. You can find these usually at your local auto store. You can of course find them online as well. They fit right in a 5-gallon bucket. They provide the same kind of separation as the commercial product has. But for me, usually I'll put in the bottom, I'll put some charcoal in order to create a free biochar as this process is underway. And then I'll put a spigot in the bottom sometimes, but I found even that's not worth it. It's just too likely to fail. I've had too many failures of the spigots when I've done it myself. So at this point, I just get a kind of snap fit lid, very similar to what you see here. These don't screw on. They're not an airtight Delta lid. They're just a pretty good seal type lid. So that's what I would do there to reduce issues. Okay, let's talk about how now you would actually start to fill it. Once you have everything in place, if you have, this is, I'm assuming, your first time using Bokashi, you would have this when you're looking down. You would just take a Bokashi Bran And most people are going to start with a commercial Bokashi brand like this one. This is just probably the one that came with this bucket actually. And you would just take a little bit of this and sprinkle it about enough to just make a single layer covering of the bottom. Then you would pile on some food scraps, really any food scraps that you have. You don't want them to be sopping wet, but basically anything, including meats, can go right into this composter. Kind of mash them down a little bit with the masher that's included, and then sprinkle a little bit more of the Bokashi Bran on top. Give it another good mash and put the lid on, and you're good to go. Now you only need to open this, or you should only open this composter maybe once a day to add compost. If you're doing it constantly, every time you open it, you're introducing oxygen, which is not the ideal environment for the bacteria that we're trying to facilitate in here. So once a day. And one other thing just to keep in mind is every time you open it, you're introducing new bacteria into the system as well. So there's always a chance that some of those bacteria could take hold and start to dominate and maybe cause some bad effects within your composting process. So that's basically how it works. Now, I'll talk a little bit about how you can kind of make your own Bokashi brand, because it is a bit expensive if you're using the commercial product. I think a bag like that's probably $30 or so. You can also buy a commercial EM1. This is a name brand of Effective Microorganisms, but really any lactobacillus type of bacteria are going to be pretty effective for creating your own Bokashi brand. And you can use anything, so whatever you use needs to be kind of a dry carbon source, but I like to use cardboard. So I'll inoculate cardboard with an expanded EM1 solution, and then I'll let that dry it out in the sun typically. And then I can use this homemade Bokashi brand and save a lot of money, as well as be kind of independent from having to rely on a vendor to provide a more expensive alternative. You can use, and I'll get into this in a future video and I'll actually kind of walk through this process, but you can actually use the native bacteria as well. You can capture native bacteria and expand that bacteria and use that to create your own Bokashi brand. One other detail, I guess, is as Bokashi compost takes place, as the composting process takes place, it does produce a decent amount of leachate, or basically liquid byproduct. It drops into a cup like this when you empty the spigot, and most of the proponents of the Bokashi process say that this liquid is very beneficial and it's good to use as a fertilizer, or as they call it, a fertilizer, although I think it's more a matter of expanding the microbiology in the soil to allow better uptake of nutrient. In any case, personally, I don't use it in that way. I've found that either it's the pH of the substance or some kind of unexpected effect tends to actually produce unpredictable results in my plants. And remember, I'm only using this in the winter time, so we're talking about house plants, and applying this to house plants for me hasn't really provided consistent results. And in fact, in some cases, I wonder if it's actually introduced problems into my house plants. Again, I think it's probably related to the pH. I just encourage you to use caution if you are planning to use it in that way. I just dump it down the drain because I'm really not so interested in trying to reuse that byproduct. I will later show you how you can use the compost itself to create a biochar or something like that, which I would recommend. It's just using the pure liquid waste isn't worth it in my opinion. Okay, so that leads us right into the next portion, which is how to use this compost product, the output of the composting process. So the output of a Bokashi composting process may be contrary to some things you would read on the internet, is a bit smelly. It's sometimes it smells better, sometimes it smells a bit worse. Just depends on how much, how sort of dead on you had your biology in the composter. Typically though, if it's perfect, so if everything is perfect, what I've experienced is the smell is like whatever you put in there except turned into a very strong coleslaw. So it's fermented, or you could say pickled version of whatever went in. The original smell, so if you put chicken in, there's still a bit of a chicken smell, but it's like a coleslaw, a chicken coleslaw. So that's, in my experience, what happens. If it doesn't quite go right, you will actually get more of a rotten smell. I've never had a batch go completely bad to where it smells like the stench of death. But, you know, I've had it where it starts to pick up some of that, and that's just from the wrong bacteria getting in there. And that's also maybe kind of a warning sign that there could be some bad pathogens in there, so you might want to be a little bit careful in general. And you always want to be careful anyways when dealing with this type of a composting process, and really all composting. So, yeah, I guess that's what it smells like. So you just need to be aware when you open this thing up and dump it, you might introduce a smell which will not last for very long, but you need to be aware of maybe the wind direction if you have some sensitive neighbors like I do. So I think that kind of summarizes the smell portion, and that was always one of my bigger questions when I was first researching it, is like, how does it smell? Well, it's, you know, you kind of got to experience it for yourself, but it's not roses, that's for sure. So what do you do then with the product? Well, what I typically do is I'll take the Bokashi compost and I just dig it right into the ground. I find that that's just the easiest way to deal with it. It works very well. You have to leave that ground fallow just briefly, maybe a month or so. Usually I'm doing this early in the springtime when it's still a little bit cold out. Just when the ground is workable, I'll start putting the Bokashi from the winter into the ground, burying it, and allowing kind of nature to take its course. Later, when usually planting time, maybe June, May, somewhere in there, I'll go ahead and plant right into that, and no problems at all. Other options though include feeding it to the black soldier flies, or even for vermicomposting, for worm composting. Worms apparently love the stuff. I'm kind of careful with my worms, so I don't usually give them the Bokashi compost, but it's definitely an option. I think that's probably a good introduction anyways to how to use the product and kind of what it's like. I do have an example of it here. Here's a live Bokashi bucket. This is one I've been keeping to put into the garden. Just haven't gotten around to it. Let's go ahead and open it up and take a look. I'll just show you what it looks like. Now this has whatever food scraps there were through the winter. Now I've added that cardboard Bokashi mix on top. The smell, yeah, it's about like, this is a fine smell. This is using actually the commercial compost, the commercial Bokashi Bran, as you can see here. And you can just see there's kind of some food scraps in there. The food doesn't look much different from when it went in. That's one thing you'll notice about this process, is it doesn't change really the look or the physical appearance of the food the way a regular kind of aerobic composting process is. That's why it's sometimes called a pre-composting, or kind of you know, a step before a kind of more thorough composting process. And that makes a lot of sense, I think, in that it's really a way to kind of compost when it wouldn't otherwise be convenient. You can't actually just plant something into this, so it's not truly a compost. It's more of a pre-processed kind of food scrap. So I guess that's probably worth mentioning, and I should have probably included it in the overview. But everybody, I've smelled that for long enough, so I'm gonna call that good. So that's your introduction to Bokashi composting. I hope it's been helpful. I can go into detail in all of the steps individually. I'll probably make some more videos on this process so I can kind of nail down the message and explain, I think, what is most important for people who are just getting started in it, as well as maybe some of the more detailed aspects of it in future videos. Please subscribe if you're interested in this type of content. Ask any questions below, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.